Hi, this is the video for Module 6, and I'm going to summarize, let's see, some of the stuff that you did for the book. I'm going to talk about the PowerPoints, some of the assignments, so forth. So let's get started. Spring, let's see. In the spring book, you were reading Chapter 6, and moving right along in history. He's been talking about the Common School, he's been talking about the ideology of the Common School, the big players, how it kind of played out. And now you're really getting into an interesting time where the sort of structure of schooling, the infrastructure, the bureaucracy, all of that really starts to take place. But there's also some other interesting changes that are taking place at this time as well. And, he calls this chapter, let's see, Organizing the American School, Teachers and Bureaucracy. So he basically talks about the keys to success for the Common School. The only way the Common School could work is if it had an infrastructure that was made it successful, if it had a stable workforce of teachers, and then of course if it had a stable curriculum or stable program, and methods of instruction, those types of things. So this is when you'll read more about it, about the feminization of teachers, of teaching, the profession. And actually there's a new book out. It just came out, I want to say in the last month. And for, history of education geeks like me, it's, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, which I'm kind of bummed about because it's about the feminization of teaching and it's supposedly a really good book. Anyway, so the feminization of teaching, and that will be another option for, you can choose that topic for one of the assignments, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But it is interesting, and there's lots of reasons for it, but you'll learn that in that chapter. So some other things that start to take place are normal schools. Okay, so teacher training comes up. This is where normal schools, where they normalize teachers and teaching. And the idea that you can actually teach teaching. See, because up to this point, I think a lot of people just sort of thought it was babysitting, and it was a way to just take care of kids during the day so their parents could work and just teach them the real basics. But, school starts to take on a little more formality, and it starts to have a broader reach and a agenda or a goal of doing a better job. So training methods, training of teachers and methods of teaching and methods of instruction, better curriculum, all of these things start to take place during this time. So you'll see people like, different ways of teaching teachers, normalizing it through normal schools, which are teacher preparation schools, usually 2-year programs. But, at least it was something where you didn't just put, just anybody in there who was willing to take the job. And then, of course, methods start to take a different tack at how to teach kids. Instead of just this sort of, memorization and rote drill and kill, the recitation, those types of things become less, they see them as less useful. And this more experiential learning style starts to take place way back during this period. So I think it's interesting that we've known about this for quite a long time. Whether or not we actually put it into play in the classroom, remains to be seen. I think, many teachers try. But anyway, so Pestalozzi, you also see something about him, and then materials become more standardized as well. And that's with the McGuffey readers, and you'll see some examples of those. So those are like the first, textbooks basically that schools would use. So a lot of this also comes about because the country is changing, industrialization is happening, and you've got a huge population growth going on. So a lot more kids are going to school. With industrialization, now you have not as many children working on farms and the flux of people going into cities. So something has to happen with their kids during the day if they're not out working in the factory. So some organization is needed, and you'll get the age-graded classroom and all these types of things. So anyway, there'll be an activity that I have listed on your checklist for this module, and I think I have you choosing 3. You choose one of the 3, only one of the 3 prompts to answer. This is my attempt at sort of a differentiated instruction method. where you can choose, and you're going to answer one of those prompts, and that's going to be in lieu of your discussion. So you don't actually have to go to the discussion post this module, but I created a Dropbox for you to go ahead and drop, that assignment into in ELC. Let's see. So in Darling Hammond, moving right along with her, let's see, Chapter 4, Inequality on Trial. Does money make a difference? Okay, so I think that that's sort of an interesting question. And to listen to politicians, to listen to legislators, or to anybody who actually has a lot of money, a lot of times they'll tell you, well, it's, money really doesn't matter. It's not money, it's how you use it. And, I suppose there are some definite arguments for those types of things, or how much is too much, that kind of a thing. But I think that Darling Hammond pretty much shows in this chapter that, money does make a difference. And especially when you've got so many underfunded schools in the country. And this is probably one of the biggest problems that our country faces today, and that is the unequal distribution of resources via taxes, because ultimately most of the schools' funding is through property taxes, and you've got a lot of property poor areas in urban centers, in rural areas, who just don't have the tax base to support their schools. So you've got just, huge levels, and you'll see this in both books, of just unequal amounts spent per student in school districts. And, the programs and resources that they can provide, it makes a really big difference. So some of the legal issues of this now are, especially since 2001 NCLB, No Child Left Behind, which basically set a bar, it set a standard, and it said all children are going to be successful. And all states, you're going to make sure, and all districts, you're going to make sure that they are successful. So when you do that, but then you don't actually give equal funding to districts, but you hold them accountable for something very substantial with consequences now, is that fair? Is it constitutional? And there have been lawsuits that have come up about basically spreading the wealth, literally, taking taxes from very wealthy districts and redistributing them to, Robin Hood, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. And there are obviously very heated arguments on both sides of this issue. So Darling Hammond presents her argument about this, and she also gives you some background on some of the legal issues involved in redistributing wealth. And also, just understand that this goes to the Constitution, back to the 14th Amendment, which, originally was one of the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. But the part of the 14th Amendment that because there's lots in the 14th Amendment, but the part of the 14th Amendment that she's talking about and that the lawyers are referring to is this unequal spending. Is it denying students their equal protection under the law? And that's the clause, that's the part of the 14th Amendment that they're ultimately concerned with. Equal protection under the law. Is that happening if you are holding all students responsible for reaching a certain level, or they get held behind, or they get, there's lots of data and lots of research that shows that the more students are held back, that they'll drop out when they get to that age that they can. Is this constitutional? Is it against the 14th Amendment? So that's an interesting chapter about that. So, I think some of the conclusions that she comes to at the end of the chapter is that we need a stable, qualified workforce, because that's another issue. We're supplying really well-educated, well-prepared teachers, experienced teachers here in this district, yet in this district we've got people walking into a classroom with almost no experience. Okay, just a degree, and sometimes not even that. So, that's an argument. And then, is it what's best for kids? Is this what's best for kids, or is this just what's best for meeting some sort of random minimum standard that we've, set for passing, so that everyone can pass? Okay, which is another whole issue in itself. All right, so that's Darling Hammond. And then in the Ravitch book, the Ravitch book, yes, the story of San Diego. What happens when you take a business person And this is certainly relevant for today because it's only gotten, I wouldn't say worse, but it's still there. What happens when you take a businessman and you say, here, run the schools, make it work, okay? Because there's a lot of businessmen out there. This is the whole ideology behind the market-based reforms is run it like a business. You know, people say that about government. It's too bureaucratic. It's too crazy. I mean, if you want it to fail, hand it over to a government agency, right? Okay, I understand. I've waited in line at the DMV. But, you know, a school is a public good. And what do you do when you try and run a school like a business? And I think this chapter shows you an example of sort of doing that at its worst. These market-based reforms, this is where it comes from. And they were building off of District 2, which she talked about in the previous chapter. And later on, actually, you're going to hear Darling Hammond talk again about District 2, so that should be interesting. But, you know, this is that top-down, centralized control of a district, which, you know, was not successful. I mean, you know, there's got to be some trust and there's got to be cooperation between all of, you know, the stakeholders of the district. And I think, again, this is an example of how that just doesn't work. And, you know, I mean, just think about a classroom. If you have a classroom, we're going to run this classroom like a business and you're not performing, I should be able to fire you, right? You can't fire kids. You know, you can't fire kids if they're not performing. So then everything turns on the only person you can fire, and that is the instructors, the teachers, you know, the principals, the administration, that type of thing. So yeah, so there's some interesting stuff in those chapters. Okay, so like I said, there's no discussion this time. You're going to do that chapter 6 activity and turn it into the Dropbox. You're going to take the quiz. Remember, you're going to watch or view a couple of PowerPoints. One of the PowerPoints I went ahead and lectured over. It got a little bit long, and I apologize for that. But anyway, I put I put the actual PowerPoint, you know, in there as well, so you can print that out. And remember, for the quizzes, they're always for the previous 2 modules. And I take a lot of those questions straight out of the books, but most of them straight out of the PowerPoints. So make sure that you have, you know, maybe a notes copy of the PowerPoint if you didn't actually download it. And then the last thing is I really want you to start thinking about what your presentation topic should be. We're getting into the 6th week. You should have some idea about an issue that you're really concerned about. Now remember, it has to be small enough in scope to just be an 8 to 10 slideshow. But, you know, with definite research and information supporting that issue. So it shouldn't be too broad, you know, and don't make it too narrow either. But again, once you start getting ideas about these issues, just start emailing me and I'll give you my feedback, and I'll try, and if you think it's too big, like if you just want to do charter schools, well, you know, you could probably do it, but that might be too big. So you may want to choose an aspect of charter schools, like, you know, I don't know how they hold teachers accountable in charter schools, or what's the average teacher that goes to work for a charter school, or these types of things. You know, do they have different standards? What are their different populations? This type of thing. So I can help you narrow down your topic if you need that. But anyway, so that's it for Module 6. And if you have any questions, let me know.